It started with a first-class ticket, a smug smile, and the sharp rip of paper echoing across a crowded airport. No one imagined that single act would spark a storm powerful enough to bring an entire airline to its knees. A black woman, dismissed as nothing, rose to her full height, exposed the truth, and made the whole system tremble. This wasn't just a ticket torn apart. It was the day justice roared in public. The terminal was alive with its usual chorus, rolling suitcases humming across tiled floors, announcements echoing through the intercom, children whining as their parents tugged them along. But at the center of the storm, right in front of the check-in counters, time seemed to slow down. Maya Jordan stood in line with her carry-on tucked firmly at her side, clutching a slim envelope that held her boarding documents. She wore a plain navy hoodie, worn jeans, and a pair of sneakers that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, no makeup, no jewelry, nothing to suggest the importance she carried beneath her quiet exterior. To anyone glancing her way, she looked like any weary traveler hoping to get home before the sun set. But that envelope in her hand, that ticket, was a first-class seat to Washington, D.C., and for reasons Maya already anticipated, that little fact was going to stir trouble. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, watching the line inch forward. Her mind wandered, not to the flight ahead, but to the grueling weeks behind her. 2 long weeks in Detroit, shuffling through crowded hangars and back offices, listening to technicians, scribbling endless notes about maintenance procedures that were more rumor than regulation. She had eaten greasy takeout in dim hotel rooms, lost sleep over reports that never seemed to end, and had smiled politely through meetings where no one suspected who she really was. Her work had always required invisibility. Now, standing here in an airport check-in line, she was still cloaked in that same disguise. The line moved forward. A tall white man in a crisp business suit stepped up to the counter, greeted warmly by the woman behind it. Linda, her name sat proudly on the silver badge pinned to her uniform. She looked to be in her 40s, her blonde hair locked into a stiff helmet of spray, her smile wide and polished as she tapped on her keyboard. The businessman chuckled at something she said. She leaned forward, lowered her voice, called him sir, with a sweetness that hung in the air. His boarding pass slid back across the counter, and he left with a satisfied nod. The interaction had been smooth, effortless, drenched in courtesy. Maya watched, her lips pressing into a thin line. She knew what was coming. She had lived it more times than she could count. Linda's smile dimmed when the next passenger stepped up, a young woman with brown skin and a hijab wrapped neatly around her head. Linda's tone sharpened. Her eyes narrowed. Questions came rapid fire. Are you sure this is your ID? When did you book this ticket? Do you understand the baggage rules? The young woman nodded timidly, her English careful and clear. Eventually, Linda let her pass, her lips twisting in disapproval as she did. The smile never returned. Maya inhaled slowly. It was a script she knew by heart, and she felt the heaviness of it settle into her chest. Her fingers tightened around the ticket. She didn't want a scene. She didn't want attention, but life rarely gave her the luxury of choosing. When her turn finally came, Linda's eyes flicked up, and the warmth that had been there for the businessman was gone. Her expression turned flat, then faintly mocking as it slid across Maya's hoodie, her jeans, the tired sneakers. Next, Linda called, her voice sharp enough to cut. Maya stepped forward, placing her ID and her ticket on the counter. She kept her posture relaxed, her face neutral. Years of training had taught her the power of composure. She was no stranger to hostile stares or dismissive tones, but she also knew that every encounter left its mark, no matter how calmly she bore it. Linda picked up the ticket between 2 manicured fingers, glancing down at the bold print, First Class, Washington, D.C. A small laugh escaped her throat. First class with this? She said, her voice loud enough for the line behind to hear. She gave Maya a slow, skeptical once over, as if to announce to the bystanders that something didn't add up. Must be nice. Who bought this for you, sweetheart? Maya kept her gaze steady. I bought it myself. Her voice was even, steady, but soft enough to betray her fatigue. Linda smirked, tapping the corner of the ticket against the counter. Well, aren't you lucky? You know, we don't usually see folks dressed like that heading up to the first-class lounge. She tilted her head toward the business travelers gathering nearby in their neat suits and polished shoes. A couple of people in line shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen, but leaning closer all the same. Maya felt the sting not from the words themselves, those were predictable, but from the way they rolled out, dripping with insinuation. It was the casual cruelty that lingered, the way Linda made a performance of it, confident she would be backed by silence. "Is there a problem with the ticket?" Maya asked quietly. Linda shrugged, her smile tight. "We'll see. These things are easy enough to fake. And people, well, people try all sorts of tricks." Her eyes traveled deliberately up and down Maya's body once more. "Especially people who don't quite fit the part." The line behind Maya grew restless. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering a question. An older man shook his head slowly, as if he'd seen this play out too many times before. The air around the counter thickened, heavy with tension. Maya steadied her breath. She wanted nothing more than to collect her boarding pass, find her seat, and disappear into the quiet of first class. But the moment had already turned. The smile on Linda's face was no longer professional. It was personal. Maya knew this wouldn't end quickly. Linda tapped the keyboard with exaggerated force, her nails clacking like a metronome of disapproval. Then, with a sudden jerk, she lifted the ticket high enough for the passengers behind Maya to see. Her voice carried over the crowd. This is a joke. First class? Not today." Maya felt her stomach tighten. The insult wasn't subtle anymore. It was meant to humiliate. And the worst part, the line of strangers watching, waiting, none daring to intervene. She reached out a hand, calm and deliberate. "Return my ticket, please." Linda's smirk widened, the challenge plain in her eyes. She leaned forward, lowering her voice so only Maya could hear. "Why don't we save everyone some time?" And then, with a sharp twist of her wrist, she tore the ticket clean down the middle. The sound of paper ripping echoed louder than it should have, a quick, violent tear that silenced even the hum of the airport around them. Two halves fluttered onto the counter, landing like broken wings. Gasps rippled through the line. Someone muttered, "Oh my God!" A phone was raised higher, its red recording light blinking. Linda crossed her arms, chin lifted in defiance. She thought she had won some petty battle. Maya stared at the pieces of her ticket, the symbol of her right to travel, of the seat she had earned now lying in ruins. For a heartbeat she said nothing. No anger, no tears, no raised voice. Just silence. And in that silence every witness felt the weight of what had just happened. Maya lifted her eyes, meeting Linda's smug expression with something far colder. She spoke softly, her words carrying anyway. "You've made a mistake." The line behind her shifted again. Some passengers looked away, ashamed. Others leaned forward, sensing that the real story had only just begun. And as Maya gathered herself, steady and unyielding, there was a sense unmistakable electric that this ordinary check-in desk had just become the stage for something much larger, something that would not end with a torn ticket, something that would change everything. For a long moment, after the sound of tearing paper faded, the air around the counter seemed frozen, as though even the airport itself had paused to witness what had just happened. Linda stood there, arms crossed, chin slightly lifted, a thin smile curling her lips as if she'd proved some kind of point. Maya remained still, her gaze fixed on the shredded ticket resting between them. She could feel the heat of dozens of eyes pressing into her back. The silence was heavy, suffocating, and yet Linda basked in it like a stage actress waiting for applause. The crowd behind Maya shifted uneasily. A businessman in a gray suit cleared his throat and looked away. A teenage girl, phone raised, whispered to her friend, "Did you see that?" The faint red light of the camera blinked steadily, capturing every second. But most faces turned down or sideways, as if pretending not to notice made them complicit in nothing. From near the stanchions, a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. He had dark hair and almond-shaped eyes that spoke of his Asian heritage, and he looked no older than 10. "Mom," he whispered too loudly, "why did she rip that lady's ticket?" The boy's voice was full of honest confusion, the kind only a child could carry. His mother, a slim woman in a tan coat, gently pressed a finger to her lips. "Quiet, Daniel," she murmured, but her eyes lingered on Maya with a mixture of sympathy and fear. She knew exactly why the ticket had been torn, but she also knew better than to explain it here, in public, where silence was safer. Maya lifted her head. Her eyes scanned the faces quickly, some nervous, some disinterested, a few quietly outraged but unwilling to act. She knew this dance by heart. It was the same wherever she went. Indignity performed in public, and the audience caught between outrage and cowardice. She had spent her life navigating that invisible line, trying not to let it break her. But still, every time, it left a mark. Linda leaned forward on the counter, her perfume sharp, her smile now broad enough to show her teeth. "Guess that seat wasn't meant for you after all," she said, loud enough for everyone in line to hear. "Better luck next time. Maybe coach is more your style." A chuckle slipped from her throat, ugly and triumphant. Maya felt her jaw tighten, but her voice, when it came, was calm. "You had no right to do that." Linda's brows lifted in mock surprise. "Oh, didn't I? Let me tell you something, sweetheart. People think they can just stroll in here dressed like that with some fancy ticket and nobody's going to question it? Not on my watch. I know a scam when I see one." She tapped the counter with her manicured nail, her voice dripping with condescension. "You think you can play dress down and fool me? I've been in this job 20 years. I can spot a fraud a mile away." The words were aimed not just at Maya, but at the line of onlookers too. She wanted witnesses, wanted validation. She wanted this to be a performance. And as if on cue, the man in the gray suit shifted his briefcase from one hand to the other and muttered, "She probably had it coming." Others stayed silent, their discomfort palpable, but still bound by fear of involvement. The young boy, Daniel, whispered again, his small voice trembling, "But Mom, she didn't do anything." His mother hushed him once more, but the child's eyes stayed wide, locked on Maya with a kind of innocent loyalty that only made Maya's heart ache. Maya straightened her shoulders. Her voice was soft but firm. "Scan the ticket. Verify it. That's your job. Not this." Linda laughed, short and sharp. "Honey, there's nothing left to scan. And frankly, even if there was, I wouldn't waste my time. Do you know how many fakes come through here? How many people try to cheat their way into a better seat? This airline doesn't need people like you thinking you can take advantage." The words "people like you" hung in the air, poisonous and undeniable. A ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. Everyone understood what it meant, even if no one dared say it aloud. Maya's eyes flickered, a flash of something hard and cold breaking through the exhaustion. She opened her mouth to reply, but a voice interrupted from behind the counter. "Linda," a man's voice barked, irritated. A stocky figure in a rumpled suit approached, his badge identifying him as Harris, floor manager. His thinning hair was slicked back, and his tie hung loose as though he'd been at this job far too long to care about appearances. He looked from Linda to the torn ticket, then to Maya, his lips pressing into a thin line. "What's going on here?" Linda wasted no time. She thrust her chin toward Maya, holding up the shredded pieces like evidence. She tried to pass off a suspicious ticket. "First class. Can you believe it? Doesn't match her ID, doesn't match her look. I wasn't about to let her waltz onto the plane and cause problems." Harris sighed heavily, as if the whole matter was nothing more than a nuisance. "Linda, for God's sake, we don't need drama. Just get her rebooked in coach and move on. We're already behind schedule." Maya felt the sting again. Coach automatically, as though it were her rightful place. Her voice sharpened, cutting through the dull murmur of the terminal. "My ticket was valid, and you just destroyed it." Harris waved a dismissive hand, already scanning the crowd for the next problem. "Lady, calm down. We'll sort it out, but let's not make a scene. We've got a full flight and no time for this." The choice of words, "calm down," was salt in the wound. It was the phrase men like Harris always used when they wanted to shut a woman up, especially a woman who didn't look like she belonged in first class. Maya's chest tightened. She thought of every time in her life someone had told her to sit down, to stay quiet, to wait her turn, and she felt the anger rising, not wild and uncontrolled, but sharp and purposeful, the kind of anger that cut through fear. Linda smirked at her boss's words, as though victory had been secured. She looked back at Maya, triumphant. "You heard the man. Why don't you just be grateful we're not calling security?" The boy, Daniel, tugged at his mother's sleeve again, whispering fiercely this time. "She didn't do anything wrong. That's not fair." His mother's eyes darted nervously around, then down at him. "Enough, Daniel." But she didn't sound convinced. Maya exhaled slowly, forcing the storm inside her back into control. Not yet. She couldn't reveal herself yet. Timing was everything, and Linda had no idea how thin the ice beneath her feet really was. She bent down, picked up the two halves of her ticket, and held them gently in her hands. The paper was torn, but not beyond recognition. Her gaze lifted once more, meeting Linda's eyes head on. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low, steady, dangerous in its calmness. For the first time, Linda's smirk faltered. It was only for a split second, but it was enough. A flicker of unease crossed her face, though she quickly masked it with another sneer. Harris, meanwhile, muttered something under his breath and turned away, already reaching for his radio to summon another agent. Around them, the line of passengers buzzed with whispers, the weight of what they had seen settling uneasily on their shoulders. Some were ashamed of their silence, others were too frightened to speak, but all of them knew the scene was far from finished. Maya slipped the torn ticket into her pocket, straightened her back, and stepped away from the counter. Her eyes burned with quiet fire. She wasn't just a weary traveler anymore. Something deeper had awakened, something Linda and Harris would soon regret underestimating. And though no one knew it yet, the real turbulence of the day had only just begun. The murmur of voices swelled around the check-in counter, as if the whole terminal had decided to lean in. Phones were out now, one in the hands of a teenager trying not to be obvious, another clutched by a man in a leather jacket who didn't bother to hide that he was recording. The red dots glowed steadily, capturing everything. Linda's sneer, the torn ticket lying like wounded flesh on the counter, Maya standing still as stone with a quiet fire behind her eyes. Then a bark of authority cut through the noise. "Linda, what the hell's going on?" The crowd shifted as a man pushed his way forward. Harris, the floor manager, was built like a bulldog stuffed into a cheap suit. His tie was stained, his shirt clung too tightly across his stomach, and his expression carried the irritation of a man who had dealt with one too many delays in his life and had learned to bulldoze through them rather than solve them. His presence made the line of passengers instinctively shuffle backward. He was the kind of manager who treated every problem like an inconvenience to his paycheck, never as something that mattered to the people in front of him. Linda straightened instantly, her smile returning, though now directed upward like a child seeking a parent's approval. She pointed at Maya with the remnants of the ticket pinched dramatically between her fingers. She tried to pass this off as valid, but I knew better. First class? Look at her. Doesn't add up. I wasn't about to let her cause trouble on my shift. Harris squinted at Maya, then at the torn pieces of paper. He sighed, a heavy, world-weary sound, and rubbed his temple. "For Christ's sake, Linda, we don't have time for this. Do you see the line behind her? Do you see the clock? We've got a full flight to get out and you're standing here playing detective?" He snatched the halves of the ticket from her and tossed them back onto the counter. Maya's voice was measured, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "That was my ticket. It was valid. She destroyed it in front of everyone." The boy, Daniel, clung to his mother's coat and whispered again, louder this time. "She's telling the truth. I saw it." His mother hushed him quickly, but her eyes darted nervously toward the growing circle of spectators. The truth was bleeding into the open, whether people liked it or not. Harris didn't even glance at the child. He held up his hand toward Maya like a traffic signal. "Ma'am, calm down. We'll sort this out, but yelling at my staff isn't going to fix anything." "I'm not yelling," Maya said softly, her voice calm but sharp enough to make a few heads lift. "I'm asking for the respect I paid for." The line behind her rippled with unease. A woman in a red scarf murmured to her husband, "She's right. This isn't how you treat people." The man only shook his head, eyes fixed firmly on the floor. Linda, emboldened by her manager's presence, leaned on the counter with her arms folded. "I told you, Harris. I've seen this before. They dress down, they flash some printout or fake ticket, and they think they can sneak into first class. Not on my shift." Maya's eyes narrowed. "You didn't even scan it. That's the procedure, isn't it? Scan the ticket, check the system. Instead, you tore it in half." Linda rolled her eyes and laughed, the sound brittle and cruel. "Please. Like I'm supposed to waste time scanning every suspicious piece of paper someone hands me? I know better. My instincts are better than any machine." Harris pinched the bridge of his nose, muttering, "We don't need this mess." He looked at Maya, his tone changing to something falsely soothing, the practiced cadence of a man who had smoothed over hundreds of complaints by dismissing them. "Here's what we'll do. We'll rebook you in coach, free of charge. You'll still get to D.C., no problem. That way we can move this line along and avoid," he gestured vaguely toward the crowd of passengers recording the scene, "any more attention." The suggestion landed like a slap. Rebooked in coach as though she should accept the downgrade as a favor, as though the destruction of her rightful ticket was nothing more than a clerical hiccup. Maya felt the tightness in her chest, the same suffocating weight she had felt countless times in her life when someone decided her place for her. She thought of the endless reports she had written about systemic failures, about bias being the crack that widened into disaster. And here it was again, raw and blatant, playing out under the fluorescent lights of an airport terminal. Her voice came low, but steady enough to silence even the whispering. "No, that won't do. I had a valid first-class ticket. I'm not moving anywhere except into the seat I paid for." Harris's brows furrowed. His patience, already thin, snapped. "Listen, lady, I don't care how you spin it. We're not holding up this flight for your attitude. You take the coach seat or you don't fly at all. Simple as that." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman near the back whispered, "Unbelievable." Daniel tugged harder at his mother's coat. "Mom, that's not fair. Say something." But his mother only bit her lip, eyes darting between Maya's calm defiance and the authority figures determined to crush it. Maya straightened, drawing in a slow breath. She was exhausted, yes, but she wasn't broken. Not now, not in front of this crowd, not with the weight of all those silent witnesses pressing in around her. She let the silence linger a moment longer, her gaze sweeping across Harris, then Linda, then the watching faces beyond them. Finally, she said, clear enough for everyone to hear, "You've already crossed a line. You don't even realize it yet. But you will." Harris scoffed, brushing off her words like a man swatting away a fly. He turned to Linda. "Get this line moving. I'll deal with her paperwork later." But as Maya's eyes burned steady and unyielding, a shift rippled through the bystanders. They weren't just watching anymore. They were witnessing. Something larger than a torn ticket had begun to unfold, and though Harris and Linda couldn't see it yet, everyone else could feel it. The balance was tilting, and the fall, when it came, was going to be devastating. The line had grown restless, a living thing shifting and murmuring under the heavy fluorescent lights. Harris stood with his hands on his hips, jaw clenched, his eyes darting between his watch and the swelling crowd. He wanted this over quickly, neatly, and above all, quietly. But there was nothing quiet about the tension pressing down on the counter where Maya still stood. Linda's smirk had returned, sharper now, the smug curl of a woman who believed she had the full weight of authority behind her. The two halves of the ticket still rested on the counter, flimsy paper carrying all the weight of injustice. "Ma'am," Harris said, his tone full of false patience, "this is your last chance. You either accept the coach seat or you don't fly. That's the end of it." The passengers behind them leaned in as if they were watching the final move in a tense chess game. Maya's calm presence unsettled Linda more than shouting ever could. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, her posture steady, her gaze locked on the people who had wronged her. The silence was heavy enough to make the boy Daniel whisper again to his mother, "Why won't they let her sit where she's supposed to?" His mother's hand squeezed his shoulder, a plea for him to hush, but her own eyes betrayed her discomfort. Linda picked up the torn ticket and held it up between her fingers like a trophy. "You see this?" she said loudly, letting her voice carry over the hum of the terminal. "This is what happens when someone thinks they can cheat the system. A fake ticket, a fake story, a fake passenger." She flicked the halves of paper disdainfully, and a few gasps rippled through the line. She was performing again, leaning into the role of gatekeeper, protector of the airline, as if her cruelty were a public service. Maya's voice, low but firm, cut through the air. "That ticket was valid. You didn't even check." Linda leaned forward, her breath hot with the faint tang of mint gum and coffee. "I don't need to check. I can see with my own eyes who belongs and who doesn't. And you, sweetheart, don't belong in first class." The words struck like a slap, echoing louder than they should have. The crowd bristled, some turning their heads away, others staring more intently. The phrase "don't belong" lingered like a poison in the air, unspoken but understood by every ear that heard it. Maya's chest tightened, but she kept her voice even. "You've crossed the line." Harris groaned, waving his hand as if to swat away the whole confrontation. "Enough. We're done here. Linda, handle this." Linda's eyes gleamed with triumph. She gripped the ticket pieces again, holding them above the counter. "Gladly," she said, and with a deliberate twist, she shredded the halves into quarters. The sound of paper ripping again echoed far too loudly, and this time it silenced even the faint murmur of the intercom overhead. The scraps fell like confetti of humiliation, scattering across the counter, slipping down to the floor. The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time, Harris's eyes widened just slightly, realizing this had gone beyond what could be smoothed over. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were bearing witness. Phones tilted higher, the red recording lights burning like tiny spotlights on Linda's smug face. Maya looked down at the shreds of paper. The ticket that had symbolized her right to sit in the seat she had paid for, that had promised a moment of rest after weeks of endless work, was gone. In its place lay only pieces, torn deliberately, like an erasure of her identity, her dignity. She felt the weight of it press into her chest. For one heartbeat, she was back in every moment she'd been told she didn't belong. On the playground as a child, in college classrooms, in boardrooms where her credentials were questioned, in airports where she was randomly selected again and again. All those years, all those moments of quiet dismissal had led here, to this counter, to these scraps of paper fluttering in stale airport air. But instead of breaking, the silence around her hardened into resolve. Maya raised her head slowly, her eyes locking onto Linda's with a steadiness that unsettled. Linda expected rage, tears, maybe even a scene loud enough to get security called in. What she got instead was stillness. A stillness so sharp it felt like the moment before a storm. "You've just destroyed a federal travel document," Maya said softly, her voice clear enough to carry to the farthest bystander. "You have no idea what you've just done." The words dropped like stones into the silence. Harris blinked, confused, and a nervous laugh escaped Linda, though her smirk wavered. "Federal document?" she scoffed. "Don't be dramatic. It was just a piece of paper." But the crowd had shifted. The bystanders weren't just witnesses anymore. They were participants now, their silence an unspoken verdict. The woman in the red scarf whispered to her husband, "She's right. That woman went too far." The teenager with the phone whispered, "This is going to go viral." Even Daniel, clutching his mother's sleeve, spoke again, louder this time. "She didn't do anything wrong. That was her ticket." His mother's face flushed, torn between silencing him and agreeing with him. Linda's laugh faltered, her eyes darting toward Harris for backup. But Harris, for all his bluster, had begun to realize the scope of the disaster. His authority suddenly felt smaller under the weight of all those recording eyes. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Maya bent slightly, gathered one of the scraps of paper from the counter, and held it between her fingers. Her hand was steady, her voice calm. "This isn't just about a seat. This is about your arrogance. And the consequences of that arrogance are bigger than either of you can imagine." The words hung there, electric and dangerous. The hush that followed was deeper than before, charged with something unnameable. Linda swallowed hard, her smirk gone, her mouth a thin, uncertain line. For the first time, she seemed to sense that she had set something in motion that she could not control. And Maya, standing in the center of it all, was no longer simply a tired traveler in a hoodie. She was something else now, something unyielding, something inevitable. The tide had begun to turn, and everyone in that terminal felt it in their bones, even if they didn't yet understand what it meant. The scraps of paper still clung to the counter like pieces of a shattered truth, but beneath the ruin of that ticket, something stronger was taking shape, something that would not be torn apart so easily. The scraps of the torn ticket still clung to the counter like a wound that refused to close. People had stopped shuffling their bags, stopped muttering to each other. Even the airport's constant hum, the boarding calls, the rolling suitcases, the chatter, seemed to fade beneath the weight of what had just happened. There was no sound except the faint, uneven breaths of the people standing shoulder to shoulder in the line, unwilling to look away. Maya did not move. Her hand rested lightly on the counter as she stared at the ruined ticket, then slowly lifted her eyes to Linda. The calmness in her gaze was unnerving, a stillness so deep that it seemed to press against the walls of the terminal itself. She did not tremble, did not lash out. Instead, she let the silence work for her, filling the space with an authority no badge or uniform could grant. Linda's smirk faltered. She had expected fireworks, anger, shouting, maybe tears. She wanted a scene, one she could point to as proof that she had been right all along. Instead, she found herself face to face with something colder, something that felt like the quiet before lightning split the sky. "You've just destroyed a federal travel document," Maya said at last, her voice low, steady, but clear enough to carry through the entire waiting area. The words did not need to be shouted. They fell heavy, each one sinking like a stone into water. A gasp rose from somewhere in the crowd. A woman clutched her handbag tighter. The boy Daniel, still gripping his mother's coat, looked up at her with wide eyes. "What does she mean, Mom?" he whispered. His mother pressed her lips together, unable to answer, her gaze locked on Maya as though watching history take shape. Harris stepped forward, his bluster returning for a moment. "All right, enough of this nonsense. Federal, my foot. Lady, it was a piece of paper, a boarding pass. Don't blow this out of proportion." His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the uncertainty creeping into his confidence. He glanced sideways at the cameras pointed in his direction, the blinking red lights that turned his dismissive tone into evidence. Maya turned her head slowly toward him, her expression unreadable. "Do you even hear yourself?" she asked softly. "You're standing here, watching your employee tear up property issued by the airline, backed by government security systems, and you call it nothing. Do you think the law will agree with you? Or will the law see it for what it is, an unlawful destruction of federal documents and a violation of passenger rights?" The words cracked through the air like a gavel striking wood. Harris shifted uncomfortably. His face flushed, but he forced a chuckle, the kind men use when they realize they've been cornered and still want to appear in control. "Lady, you're making a scene. Let's calm down before this gets blown out of hand." The silence answered for him. No one laughed with him. No one nodded. Even the murmurs of the crowd had stilled, as if everyone were waiting for Maya's next words. She lowered her voice even further, the quiet sharpening it into steel. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Linda scoffed, though the sound was thin, fragile. "Oh, please. What are you going to do? Sue us? Go ahead. I've got 20 years with this airline. You think anyone's going to take your side over mine?" She turned toward the line of passengers, seeking validation. "Folks try to scam us every day. You can dress it up however you want, but we all know what was going on here." But the crowd did not reward her performance. Instead, the teenager holding up his phone called out, "I've got it all recorded, every word, every look." A ripple of agreement moved through the line, a wave of shifting bodies and nodding heads. People had been quiet before, but the tide had turned. The silence was no longer protective of Linda. It was damning. Maya did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply let her eyes rest on Linda's face, her expression unbroken, her voice calm. "This isn't about a seat on a plane. This is about accountability. And right now, you've written yourself into a story you won't escape." Daniel tugged on his mother's sleeve again, whispering loudly, "She sounds like a teacher, like when the principal's about to call your parents." His mother tried to hush him, but her eyes glistened with something that looked suspiciously like pride. The hush deepened again, swallowing the space. Harris's radio crackled on his hip, but he didn't move to answer it. He was caught between the weight of authority he thought he held and the reality unraveling before him. Linda's fingers twitched nervously against the counter, her confidence bleeding away under the pressure of a silence that had turned hostile. Maya bent down, picked up another scrap of her ticket from the counter, and held it between her fingers as though it were evidence in a courtroom. She raised her eyes, her voice quiet but resonant. "You think tearing up paper erases the truth? You think humiliation keeps people in their place? You've made a mistake, and the consequences are coming faster than you realize." The stillness that followed was almost unbearable. It was the kind of silence that carries a pulse, that makes the skin prickle and the air feel charged. The passengers, the phones, the whispered voices, all seemed suspended in that single moment. Linda opened her mouth, but no words came. Harris shifted, muttered under his breath, but nothing he said mattered anymore. Because in that silence, the shift had already happened. Maya was no longer the woman at the counter begging for her rights. She was the center of the storm, and everyone in that terminal, manager, worker, passenger, felt it. Something irreversible had been set into motion, and the air itself seemed to know it. And though no one could name it yet, everyone understood. The quiet was not weakness. It was power. The kind of power that comes just before the sky cracks open and the thunder rolls in. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The shreds of Maya's ticket lay scattered like ashes across the counter, silent proof of the insult that had been done to her. The silence was thick enough to feel as if the entire terminal had been sealed off from the outside world. People stood frozen, not even pretending to fuss with their bags anymore, their eyes locked on the confrontation that had become impossible to ignore. Harris shifted from one foot to the other, muttering under his breath, his radio buzzing at his hip with unanswered calls. Linda's smirk had drained into something tighter, more brittle, though she still clung to it like armor. She expected Maya to cry, to shout, to collapse under the humiliation. What she never expected was stillness. Maya lifted her chin, her gaze steady and unyielding. Her voice carried across the waiting area, low but sharp as glass. "You've destroyed a federal travel document. That's not an inconvenience. That's a crime." A gasp rose from the crowd. The boy Daniel whispered urgently to his mother. "She said it's a crime." His mother didn't answer. She was too busy staring at Maya with wide eyes, her lips parted as if she herself were hearing a verdict being read. Harris barked a laugh, though it wavered, uncertain. "Federal, lady? Don't start with that nonsense. You think tearing up a boarding pass is a federal case? Don't make a fool of yourself." But Maya didn't flinch. She reached calmly into the inside pocket of her hoodie, pulled out a small leather wallet, and laid it on the counter with deliberate care. The snap of the fold opening cut through the silence like a gunshot. Inside was a badge, gleaming beneath the harsh lights, stamped with the seal of the Federal Aviation Administration. Gasps rippled through the crowd again, louder this time, followed by a wave of murmurs. Phones zoomed in. The red recording lights glowed brighter. "My name is Maya Jordan," she said, her voice no longer weary, but carrying the sharp, precise cadence of authority. "I am a senior field inspector for the FAA's Office of National Security and Incident Response. And what you have done here, in front of all these witnesses, will not be brushed aside as a simple mistake." The words dropped into the terminal like thunderclaps. The businessman in the gray suit stepped back, his face blanching as he realized what had just unfolded. The teenager recording muttered under his breath, "Holy hell, she's FA." Even Daniel's mother let out a quiet gasp, pulling her son closer as if to shield him from the explosion that was about to follow. Linda's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. That can't be real," she stammered. "Anybody can carry around a fake badge. You're just bluffing. Nobody dresses like that if they're important." Her voice shook, betraying the panic seeping in. Maya's eyes hardened, but her tone remained steady, almost surgical. "I dress the way I choose when I'm working undercover. Operation Iron Wings has been running quietly for 2 weeks, and you've just blown it open with your arrogance." She tapped her phone, dialing from her favorites without hesitation, the screen glowing as she held it to her ear. "Director Evans, this is Jordan. I'm invoking a code black at Terminal C, Gate 12. Immediate FAA and TSA response required. We have destruction of federal property, potential security compromise, and personnel misconduct at the managerial level." Every word was deliberate, not just for the man on the other end, but for the entire terminal to hear. The crowd erupted in whispers, shock running through them like a current. Harris's face had drained of color. He took a step back, as though distance might somehow save him. "Wait just a damn minute," he sputtered. "You can't, this isn't how things work. You can't just shut down a gate like that." Maya lowered her phone, her voice steady but cutting. "You've been in this business long enough to know better, Mr. Harris. There are protocols when something seems suspicious, scanning the document, calling a supervisor, verifying through the system. At no point does the procedure include tearing up a passenger's documentation because you don't like the way they look. That isn't procedure. That's prejudice. And now it's negligence in the face of federal law. Harris's mouth went dry. His eyes darted to Linda, but she was shrinking fast, her bravado bleeding out with every second. I was protecting the flight, she muttered, her voice small, desperate. It didn't look right. Her clothes, the way she... The words hung there, ugly and undeniable. The crowd reacted audibly this time. A man shook his head in disgust. A woman whispered, "God help her," as if Linda had just dug her own grave. The teenager's phone captured every syllable. Maya leaned forward, her voice quiet now, but so sharp it sliced the air. "Say it clearly. Was it the ticket you thought was fake, or was it the fact that a black woman was holding it?" Linda's face flushed deep crimson. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. Harris opened his mouth as if to intervene, but he knew better than to try. The silence that followed was louder than any accusation. Then, like a wave breaking, the distant sound of radios crackled. Security officers in dark uniforms appeared at the end of the terminal, striding quickly, their presence carrying the weight of authority. Behind them, two individuals in sharp suits moved with deliberate confidence, the unmistakable presence of federal agents. The atmosphere in the gate area shifted immediately, the casual hum of airport life collapsing into the charged intensity of an active investigation. Linda backed up a step, her confidence gone, her eyes wide as she realized the walls were closing in. Harris muttered again, but his voice had lost its edge, reduced to incoherent excuses. Maya stood tall, her badge still glinting on the counter, her phone still in her hand. The tired traveler in sneakers and a hoodie had disappeared. In her place stood the inspector, the enforcer, the embodiment of accountability. She swept her gaze across the crowd, across the cameras, across the faces of those who had borne silent witness. "This gate is now a federal scene," she said, her tone cold and resolute, "and nothing that has happened here will be forgotten." The silence that followed was not disbelief anymore. It was awe. The storm had broken, and everyone knew the reckoning had only just begun. The first to arrive were the uniformed airport security officers, their radios crackling with clipped instructions as they pushed through the gathering crowd. Their presence broke the invisible barrier that had held everyone frozen in silence. The crowd began to part, some passengers stepping back with murmured relief, others craning their necks to keep their phones trained on the scene. Right behind the officers came two figures in sharp suits, their strides purposeful, their expressions severe. One carried a slim folder, the other scanned the area like a hawk, taking in every detail. It didn't take an expert to know they weren't airport staff. They were federal. Harris tried to regain control, puffing out his chest as he stepped toward them. "Finally some backup," he said, his voice loud, desperate to reclaim authority. "We've got a passenger making wild claims, disrupting operations, trying to..." "Stop!" The taller of the two agents raised a hand, his voice firm and low, commanding attention without raising volume. "Who is Harris?" The manager froze mid-sentence. His name had rolled off the agent's tongue with clinical certainty, like it had been handed down to him before he even arrived. Harris cleared his throat, his confidence shrinking. "That's me. I'm the floor manager here." The shorter agent, a woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing, stepped forward. "Then you'll understand why we're not here to back you up. We're here because a federal inspector invoked Code Black." She pointed toward Maya, still standing calm and resolute at the counter, her badge resting in plain sight. "This is her scene now." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Harris's jaw went slack. He looked from Maya to the agents and back again, his hands twitching uselessly at his sides. "Code Black? That's insane. This is just a misunderstanding. She had a suspicious ticket. My staff acted to destroy valid documentation." Maya cut in, her voice like steel slicing through paper. She stepped forward, lifting one of the scraps of her ticket from the counter, holding it between her fingers like evidence in a courtroom. "Your staff member not only violated procedure, but committed destruction of federally protected property. And you," she turned her gaze squarely on Harris, "enabled it. You brushed off complaints. You dismissed bias as instinct. How many times has this happened before? The female agent pulled a notepad from her jacket pocket, jotting down the names, the time, the gate number. Her eyes lifted to Harris, cold and unwavering. You're aware that complaint logs are federal records once they're tied to passenger discrimination claims, correct? Harris stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. We handle those internally. Customer service issues, nothing federal. Maya's voice was low, but carried the weight of truth. Every single complaint you buried became tinder. And today this, she held up the shredded ticket, her eyes flicking to Linda, was the spark. Linda, pale now, tried to gather the remnants of her bravado. I was doing my job. My instincts told me it was fake. I was protecting the flight. Your instincts? Maya's eyes narrowed, her tone measured. The law doesn't give you authority to act on instinct. The law gives you procedure. Scan, verify, escalate to a supervisor if needed. That's it. What you did wasn't protection. It was profiling. It was arrogance. And it's over. The crowd stirred, murmurs swelling. The businessman in the gray suit who had earlier muttered about Maya probably deserving what happened now looked at his shoes, shame reddening his ears. The teenager with the phone whispered into the mic of his earbuds, "This is unreal. She's burying them alive." One of the uniformed officers stepped closer to Linda, his hand hovering near his belt. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stay right here until we get this sorted." His tone wasn't harsh, but it was firm, the kind that made it clear she wasn't free to walk away. Linda's face went ashen. "You're treating me like a criminal." Maya met her gaze with calm precision. "Because that's exactly what you've made yourself." The female agent looked at Harris again. How many complaints had been filed against this employee? Harris swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward the crowd, then back at the agent. "I don't have the exact number on me. A handful, maybe." Maya's voice sharpened, her words deliberate. "Not a handful, dozens. We both know it. Ignored, buried, waved off as customer impatience, and every one of them is about to see daylight." Linda shook her head, stammering, That's not fair. People exaggerate. They take things the wrong way. You can't judge me based on a few complaints." Maya's eyes cut through her. "No, Linda, you'll be judged on this." She gestured to the shreds of paper still clinging to the counter. "On this moment. Because it's no longer just words against yours. It's proof. It's recorded. And it's the last mistake you'll make in this uniform." The crowd broke into low gasps, some even nodding in agreement. For the first time, the weight of collective judgment turned against Linda and Harris. The silence of bystanders was no longer protecting them, it was condemning them. The taller agent finally spoke, his voice like a closing door. "Effective immediately, this gate is under federal jurisdiction. All personnel are to remain in place for questioning, no exceptions." Harris sputtered, "But we've got a plane to board." The agent cut him off with a look that could freeze fire. "The plane isn't going anywhere. Not until this investigation is complete." Passengers groaned, some checking their watches, but no one argued. They had seen too much to pretend this was a delay like any other. This wasn't weather. This wasn't maintenance. This was justice, unfolding in real time. Maya stepped back, her badge gleaming in the harsh light, her posture unflinching. The dominoes had begun to fall one by one, and there would be no stopping them now. Linda clutched the counter like it was the only thing holding her up. Harris dabbed at his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief, his authority bleeding out of him with every passing second. The boy Daniel looked up at his mother, whispering with the solemn awe only a child could muster. "She's not just a passenger, is she?" His mother's eyes never left Maya. She shook her head slowly, her voice hushed but certain. "No, sweetheart, she's something else." And as the federal agents tightened the circle, the truth settled over the gate like a storm cloud. What began with a torn ticket had become a reckoning, and the people who thought they held power now realized they were standing at the edge of their own collapse. The air around Gate 12 was charged, humming with the kind of energy that makes your skin prickle. Federal agents were in control now, their voices low and commanding, their movements precise. Security officers kept passengers at bay, though the crowd remained close enough to watch every moment, their phones raised high like a forest of unblinking eyes. For Linda, the counter that had once been her stage now felt like a trap. For Harris, the weight of years of neglect and excuses pressed down on his chest like a stone. And for Maya, the moment to strip away all pretense had finally come. She stepped forward, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and fixed her gaze on Linda. The silence stretched, deep and suffocating, until the only sound was the faint crackle of a radio somewhere down the concourse. Maya's voice, when it came, was steady, low, but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Tell us, Linda," she said. "What about me was suspicious? Was it the ticket, or was it the color of my skin?" The question hung in the air like a blade, daring anyone to move. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The businessman in the gray suit swallowed hard, his earlier mutters about scams now ashes in his throat. A woman in a red scarf shook her head slowly, whispering, "Lord help her," though it wasn't clear if she meant Linda or the inspector standing before her. Linda's face drained of color, then flushed crimson as all eyes turned on her. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Her hands twitched against the counter, as if she could hold on to it for balance. "It wasn't like that," she stammered, her voice too high, too thin. "I just had a feeling. The ticket didn't look right, that's all." Maya's eyes narrowed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You had a machine to verify it, a scanner, a system. You didn't use it. Instead, you tore it up. That wasn't procedure. That was bias. Say it. Was it my clothes, my sweatshirt, my sneakers? Or was it simply that a black woman was holding a first-class ticket? The crowd murmured louder now, a wave of voices swelling against Linda's faltering composure. A man near the back called out, "Answer her!" His voice cracked with something close to outrage. The teenager with the phone whispered, "She's got her dead to rights." Linda's lip trembled. "I didn't mean," she began, but the words fell apart before they reached her tongue. Her eyes darted desperately toward Harris. "Tell them. You know how people try to fake their way into first class. I was just protecting the airline." Harris stepped forward, his forehead glistening with sweat, but the female federal agent's sharp gaze pinned him in place before he could finish a word. "Careful, Mr. Harris," she warned. "We've already pulled preliminary logs. Complaints against your staff aren't rumors, they're records, and they point to a pattern. Every time a person of color, every time someone foreign-born, every time someone with a disability, your office buried the reports. So I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." The weight of the truth pressed harder. Linda's knees seemed to weaken. She braced herself against the counter, her smirk long gone, replaced by the wide-eyed fear of someone who realized the ground beneath her was caving in. She tried again, her words tumbling over each other. It's not what it looks like, I swear. I just thought, her attitude, the way she..." Maya cut her off, her voice ringing with a quiet finality. "Asking you to do your job is not attitude. It's expectation, and you failed." The crowd erupted in murmurs, some sharp with anger, others heavy with relief that someone had finally spoken aloud what so many had seen. Daniel, the boy in the tan coat, tugged at his mother's sleeve and said, louder this time, "She's right. That lady was mean from the start." His mother's eyes darted nervously around, but she didn't hush him. She only held him tighter, her gaze fixed on Maya like a beacon. Linda's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted to the cameras pointed at her, to the agent scribbling notes, to the passengers whispering like a jury delivering its verdict. She had been queen of the counter only minutes ago, doling out smiles and sneers as though she owned the place. Now she was exposed, stripped bare by a single, undeniable question. Maya stepped closer, closing the space between them. She lowered her voice, but the silence was so complete that every word carried to the back of the crowd. "You wanted to humiliate me. Instead, you humiliated yourself. And now you've given this entire terminal a lesson in what prejudice looks like under fluorescent lights." Linda flinched as though struck. Harris rubbed a trembling hand across his forehead, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own complicity. The agents exchanged a glance, their expressions grim but resolute. This was no longer a customer dispute. This was evidence, unfolding in real time. Maya picked up another scrap of her shredded ticket from the counter, held it between her fingers, and let it fall back to the surface like a gavel striking wood. Her eyes never left Linda's. "This isn't over," she said, her voice calm, almost quiet. "This is only the beginning." The words sealed the moment. The crowd knew it. The agents knew it. Even Harris and Linda knew it. What had begun as arrogance had become a reckoning, and the balance of power had shifted so completely that no one could pretend otherwise. The silence that followed was no longer confusion. It was certainty. And as the agents moved closer, ready to tighten the circle around those responsible, the sense settled over everyone present. The storm had broken, and the truth was no longer something that could be torn apart like paper. It was here, and it was unstoppable. The terminal had shifted from its ordinary hum into something tense and electric, a theater where everyone was pressed into service as witness. The crowd hung on every word, every breath, as though missing a moment would mean missing the truth itself. Maya stood at the counter, her badge still glinting, her presence commanding even the silence. Linda looked hollowed out, her arms hugging her middle, as though bracing against a chill that came from within. Harris's face was flushed, his handkerchief damp from wiping the sweat that never seemed to stop. And just when the scene felt locked into its grim rhythm, a new voice cut across it. "What in God's name is going on here?" The words were barked from the side of the gate, and heads turned to see a man in a pilot's uniform striding toward them. His cap was tucked under one arm, his silver hair gleaming under the harsh lights, his steps carrying the kind of authority born of thousands of flight hours. Captain Rhodes, the pilot of the very flight now grounded, had arrived. His expression was taut with impatience, his jaw set like stone. Behind him trailed a couple of flight attendants, their eyes wide and uncertain, clearly caught between their loyalty to the crew and the reality unraveling before them. Harris's face lit up with relief, as if salvation had just arrived. "Captain Rhodes," he said quickly, his voice almost trembling. "Thank God. We've got a passenger here making wild accusations, trying to shut down the gate. Linda did her job, I backed her up, and now it's spiraling out of control." The crowd shifted, murmuring. Rhodes looked directly at Maya, his eyes sweeping over her hoodie, her sneakers, her calm but unyielding stance. He frowned, then turned to Harris. "We have a plane full of people waiting to board, and you let it get to this point? What the hell are you doing?" Before Harris could reply, Maya spoke. Her voice was steady, cutting across his excuses. "What he's doing is trying to downplay a crime that happened in front of dozens of witnesses." Rhodes blinked, his frown deepening. "A crime?" "She destroyed a valid federal travel document," Maya said, her gaze steady on him. "And he enabled her. Instead of following procedure, they substituted prejudice for process. And now you're standing here, about to defend it." The words struck hard, and the crowd reacted, a ripple of gasps and whispers. Rhodes straightened his shoulders, his voice dropping into the low rumble of someone used to command. "With all due respect, ma'am, I don't know who you think you are, but tearing up a boarding pass isn't a federal crime. It's an inconvenience, and I can't have you jeopardizing an entire flight over it. We have a schedule to keep." Maya didn't flinch. She picked up her badge from the counter and held it up for him to see. "I'm not jeopardizing your schedule, Captain. I'm enforcing the law. I'm Inspector Maya Jordan, FAA, and I invoked Code Black because what happened here today is not an inconvenience. It's a breach, and the investigation doesn't stop at a ticket." The murmurs surged into audible shock. Rhodes's jaw tightened, but his eyes narrowed with skepticism. "FAA or not, you're making a spectacle. This kind of thing, it happens. Employees make judgment calls. Not every call is perfect, but it's not grounds to ground a flight." It was the wrong thing to say, and the agent standing nearby knew it. The female agent stepped forward, her eyes cold and piercing. "Captain Rhodes, do you consider it acceptable for employees to ignore security protocols and act on their own bias? Because our records suggest this isn't the first time your station has ignored complaints." Rhodes shifted uneasily, but his voice carried defiance. "Look, I run the cockpit. I don't run the gate. My responsibility is to get passengers safely from one airport to another. I trust my crew on the ground to do their jobs." Maya's eyes sharpened. She stepped closer, her voice quiet but cutting enough to pierce the growing tension. "Trust is not a control. It's an excuse. Did you ever notice? The repeated complaints, the passengers humiliated at your gate, the shortcuts taken to make sure your flight's left on time? Did you ever question it? Or was it easier to look away?" Rhodes opened his mouth, but nothing came. The silence that followed was brutal. The passengers, the flight attendants standing behind him, even Harris, everyone was staring, waiting for his answer. The only sound was the scratch of the female agent's pen as she wrote in her notebook. Finally, Rhodes spoke, his tone defensive. I've heard whispers, people grumbling about gate staff being tough, but nothing concrete, nothing I could act on. We're all under pressure to keep schedules tight. You think I can afford to chase every rumor? Maya's voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in conviction. Every rumor is a warning. And in aviation, ignoring warnings gets people killed. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. That's why we have procedures. That's why bias is more than just cruel. It's dangerous. And you knew. You all knew. The words landed like blows, and the crowd reacted audibly. A woman near the back said loudly, "She's right." Another man muttered, "Finally, someone's saying it." Rhodes's face was flushed now, his composure cracking. You don't know what kind of pressure we're under. You sit in your office writing rules while we live with the consequences if a flight doesn't go out on time. You don't know what it's like. Maya's eyes were steady, her voice calm. I do know. And I also know that ignoring discrimination, ignoring complaints, ignoring safety protocols for the sake of on-time departures doesn't make you efficient. It makes you complicit. The word struck hard. Complicit. It echoed in the terminal, louder than any announcement over the intercom. Rhodes's mouth tightened, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of it. Behind him, the flight attendants exchanged uneasy looks, as though acknowledging aloud what they'd long whispered among themselves. The agents moved in closer, one of them speaking in a low but firm tone. Captain Rhodes, we'll be pulling your maintenance logs and communication records for the last 6 months. If you've signed off on falsified reports, now's the time to say so. Otherwise, you'll be explaining it under oath. Rhodes's defiance faltered. His jaw worked, but his voice failed him. The realization crept over his face. This wasn't just about one torn ticket anymore. This was about years of looking the other way. Maya turned back to the crowd, her words steady, resonant. This isn't just about me. This is about every person who's been dismissed, humiliated, ignored, because someone decided they didn't belong. And it's about every shortcut taken in the name of profit and speed. The lies don't stop at this counter. They reach into the cockpit, into the logs, into the very heart of this airline. And it ends now. The terminal fell silent again, but it wasn't the silence of confusion anymore. It was the silence of reckoning. The passengers weren't just watching. They were bearing witness. And for the first time, even Captain Rhodes seemed to realize that the dominoes he had thought he could ignore were toppling, one after another, with no way to stop them. The terminal, once just another ordinary stretch of polished floors and fluorescent lights, had transformed into something else entirely. It no longer felt like a place for boarding planes or grabbing coffee on the way to a flight. It felt like a courtroom, and every person standing shoulder to shoulder around Gate 12 was now part of a trial. The hum of rolling luggage and boarding calls from distant gates seemed faint, drowned beneath the slow, tense rhythm of something irreversible closing in. The air had grown heavy, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when even breathing feels loud. Maya stood in the center of it, her presence no longer quiet or unassuming, but radiating an authority that no uniform could challenge. She turned, her gaze sweeping across the counter, the scraps of her destroyed ticket, the agents and officers now closing ranks. Her voice cut through the air with unshakable calm. This gate is now under federal jurisdiction. Effective immediately, no one leaves. No one touches evidence. No one deletes records. From this moment forward, this is a locked federal scene. The crowd rippled in shock. Passengers shifted uneasily, whispering, their phones catching every second. Some groaned audibly, already thinking of missed connections and ruined plans. A man in a polo shirt muttered, "You've got to be kidding me," while a woman with a toddler clutched her child closer, eyes darting between Maya and the federal agents. But no one dared to argue. The authority in her tone was not something that invited debate. Harris sputtered first, his face crimson. You can't do that. Do you have any idea what a delay like this will cost? We'll have corporate breathing down my neck. You can't just—" Maya's eyes snapped to him, her voice still low, but so sharp it silenced him mid-sentence. "Watch me." She turned to the agents. Secure the surveillance feeds. Every angle. Now, before someone thinks about scrubbing them. The female agent nodded, already speaking into her comm, her clipped words echoing like hammer strikes. Two officers moved to the corner where the cameras blinked silently, their hands swift and efficient as they radioed for technical support to preserve the data. Passengers leaned forward, craning their necks to watch the unfolding scene. The teenager who had been recording whispered breathlessly, "This is insane. They're sealing off the gate, like it's a crime scene." "It is," someone else answered quietly. Linda stood stiff behind the counter, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles blanched white. She looked like a puppet with its strings cut, hollow-eyed, unable to summon the bravado that had once carried her sneer. She whispered, almost to herself, "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." Maya turned her gaze on her, her tone cool, steady. "Oh, it's happening, and every second of it is on record." The boy Daniel, unable to keep quiet, tugged at his mother's sleeve again. "Mom, she sounds like the police." His mother bent down, whispering back with a faint, shaky smile. "She's more than that, sweetheart. She's the one making the police listen." The murmurs from the passengers grew louder, voices carrying fragments of outrage and awe. Some grumbled about delays, others about justice long overdue. Every word filled the air with the weight of history being written in real time. Maya straightened and turned to the assembled crowd, her voice calm but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I know you're frustrated. I know some of you are angry about your flights. But let me make this clear. What happened here wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a violation of law, a violation of trust, and a violation of every person who's ever been told they don't belong. You have become witnesses to an investigation that will reach far beyond this gate, and I will make sure your voices, your recordings, and your presence count." The words landed hard, silencing even the grumbling passengers. They weren't just delayed travelers anymore. They were part of a story larger than themselves. Their silence, their recordings, their witness suddenly mattered. Harris groaned, dragging a hand down his face. His authority, once carried like a shield, looked like dead weight now. "You don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Corporate, they'll bury this. They'll find a way. They always do." Maya's eyes cut to him, cool and sharp. "Not this time. Not with the evidence sitting in plain view. Not with 100 cameras recording. Not with federal jurisdiction already established. This isn't a secret you can bury in paperwork, Mr. Harris. This is already bigger than you." Linda let out a broken sound, somewhere between a sob and a gasp. "I didn't mean," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was just following my instincts." Maya's gaze fixed on her. "Instincts don't tear tickets, Linda. Choices do, and yours will follow you for the rest of your life." The crowd hushed again, the words falling like stones into water. The flight attendants who had followed Captain Rhodes shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves. One finally murmured, "She's right. We all knew something was wrong. We just kept quiet." The admission cut through the air, adding weight to Maya's case. The agents moved methodically, bagging scraps of the ticket, taking names from passengers who had witnessed the destruction, securing every angle of video evidence. Radios clicked with updates, the kind of clipped jargon that carried authority in every syllable. And then Maya gave the order that sealed the moment. Her voice was calm, unshakable. "This gate is closed. Flight 12 is not departing. Not today." Groans erupted, sharp with frustration, but none dared challenge her. Captain Rhodes, standing stiff with fury, snapped, "You can't ground my flight." Maya's eyes turned on him, and even his years of command wilted beneath her gaze. "It isn't your flight anymore, Captain. It's a federal investigation, and you will cooperate." The silence that followed was total. Rhodes's mouth tightened, his fury visible, but his authority was gone. Harris slumped against the counter, sweat running down his temple. Linda stared blankly at the scraps of ticket bagged as evidence, her whole body trembling. The crowd, restless but riveted, understood they weren't just witnesses to a delay. They were witnesses to the unraveling of power. The fluorescent lights hummed above. Radios crackled. Cameras recorded. And in the center of it all, Maya stood steady. The quiet storm that had transformed humiliation into justice. What had started with a sneer and a torn ticket had now become an unstoppable tide. And the people who once thought they controlled this space now stood powerless, trapped in the very system they had abused. And though the flight had been grounded, no one watching could shake the sense that something far greater had just taken off. The gate had fallen into an eerie rhythm. What had once been the chatter of impatient travelers had quieted into something heavier, a low hum of disbelief and whispered questions. Passengers leaned against stanchions, clutching their phones, whispering into earbuds to family waiting on the other end of missed connections. The scene looked like chaos from a distance, but up close it felt like order being carved out of arrogance, justice cutting through the noise with scalpel precision. Federal agents moved methodically, collecting scraps of the ticket, logging statements, directing officers to preserve surveillance footage. The hum of their radios was constant, crisp commands blending with the faint static. Maya stood a few feet back from the counter, her arms folded, watching it all unfold with a quiet intensity. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smiling. She carried the posture of someone who had seen too many scenes just like this, who knew that the moment of humiliation was never the end, but only the beginning of something bigger, deeper, and more dangerous. Her eyes, sharp and focused, rested on Harris as he sat heavily in a chair that had been pulled up from the boarding area. His once loud voice had shrunk into mutters, excuses muttered mostly to himself. "Corporate will never let this stand," he whispered under his breath. "It'll blow over. They'll spin it. They always do." The female agent standing beside him didn't even look up from her notepad. "You should worry less about corporate spin and more about federal subpoenas, Mr. Harris, because from where I'm standing, this isn't the first time complaints have been ignored, and that makes you liable." Harris wiped his forehead with his crumpled handkerchief, his skin clammy. His eyes darted toward Linda, still rooted behind the counter like a statue, her face pale, her lips pressed tight together. She hadn't spoken in minutes, her earlier bravado drained completely away. She looked smaller now, her hands clasped as though in prayer, but her eyes kept flicking toward Maya like a rabbit watching the shadow of a hawk above. The agents had already started pulling up complaint records. They had terminals logged into the airline system, and one by one, the documents flashed across the screen, damning in their ordinariness. A woman with an accent denied boarding 3 times for vague documentation issues. A black family told their tickets were invalid until a supervisor intervened, but no report ever filed. A young man in a wheelchair made to wait until all other passengers had boarded before being allowed to roll down the jet bridge. Every incident a scar small enough to be buried when taken alone, devastating when collected into a pattern. Maya stepped closer, her voice low but sharp as she addressed Harris directly. "How many times did passengers file these complaints, and how many times did you bury them with a note about counseling your staff? How many times did you choose silence because silence was easier than accountability?" Harris shook his head weakly. "It wasn't like that. You don't understand. The airline wants flights on time. Every delay costs money. They wanted efficiency, not justice?" Maya's interruption was soft, almost gentle, but it cut deeper than any shout. "Not decency? Not following the law? You let prejudice masquerade as procedure, and every time you looked away, you told your staff it was acceptable to act on it again and again, until we arrived here." She gestured to the shred ticket bagged on the table beside the agents, until arrogance turned into evidence. The crowd stirred, their murmurs swelling louder. Passengers who had stood quietly began nodding, their faces tight with recognition. They had all seen moments like this, at gates, at counters in restaurants and stores. They had all watched prejudice slip under the radar, excused with a shrug or a nervous laugh. Now they were watching someone stand against it, and it was impossible not to feel the gravity of it. Linda finally broke, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I thought." Maya's eyes snapped to her, pinning her with quiet intensity. "You thought what? That your instincts were above the rules? That the way I looked gave you the right to decide I didn't belong? Be honest, Linda. Because every passenger here already knows the truth." Linda's chest heaved, her eyes glossy. I thought I was protecting the flight." The words rang hollow, brittle, breaking in her throat. The crowd didn't buy it. The agents didn't buy it. Not even Harris could muster a nod of support. "No," Maya said, her voice quiet, final. "You weren't protecting anything. You were feeding your prejudice. And you turned it into action. That's not protection. That's negligence. And it's criminal." The silence that followed was suffocating. The crowd wasn't restless anymore. They were fixed, transfixed, as though carved into place by the sheer inevitability of the truth spilling into the open. The teenager with the phone whispered, "She just buried her," to no one in particular. One of the agents handed Maya a folder. She opened it, scanning the printouts inside. Her voice carried as she read aloud. "Complaint filed December 23rd. Passenger Mrs. Now Garcia alleges she and her son were denied boarding until every other traveler had been seated. Passenger identifies gate agent as Linda Kowalski. Case closed by Supervisor Harris with a note, counseled employee." She flipped the page. "Complaint filed March 8th. Passenger David Chin alleges gate agent asked if he spoke English despite valid identification. Gate agent identified as Linda. Case closed by Supervisor Harris. Verbal warning." She looked up, her eyes hard. "This isn't history. This is a pattern, and today it became a federal case." Harris put his head in his hands, muttering, "I told her to be careful. I told her." His voice cracked, breaking apart. Maya let the silence swallow his excuses. She turned to face the passengers instead, her words meant for them as much as for the recorders. "This is what happens when complaints are ignored. When bias is brushed off as nothing more than a bad day, it grows, it festers, until one moment of arrogance opens the door and lets the whole rot spill into the open. And now it has." The passengers shifted, some with tears in their eyes, some holding their phones higher, capturing every word. The boy Daniel clutched his mother's hand and whispered fiercely, "She's telling the truth. She's telling all of it." His mother squeezed his hand, her eyes wet but steady. The federal agents kept working, their voices low and purposeful, but the sense in the room had changed. This was no longer just about a torn ticket. This was about the ghosts of the past, the buried complaints, the silenced voices, the years of arrogance and neglect. All of it was rising now, undeniable, unstoppable. Maya's voice dropped lower, almost intimate, as she spoke again, though the entire gate seemed to lean in to hear it. "This isn't a bad apple, not anymore. This is a rotten orchard, and every tree is about to be cut down." The words fell heavy, leaving no room for doubt. Linda's head bowed. Harris looked like a man awaiting a sentence he already knew was coming. And the crowd, united in their silence, understood they were witnessing not just justice, but the exposure of something long hidden in plain sight. The ghosts had been called out into the light, and there would be no sending them back into the dark. The hours that followed at Gate 12 unfolded like a slow-moving storm, deliberate and unstoppable. Federal agents worked through the night, their presence a reminder that this was no longer just a customer service dispute, but a matter of national accountability. Employees were escorted to secure rooms for questioning, surveillance footage was copied and preserved, and every shred of evidence was logged with painstaking precision. The flight that had once promised to take passengers to Washington never left the ground. Instead, the gate became the center of something far larger, a reckoning that would ripple far beyond the walls of the airport. Maya stood at the center of it, never once raising her voice, never once letting anger eclipse the steadiness of her purpose. She didn't need to. The badge at her side, the conviction in her words, and the gravity of the silence around her were more powerful than shouting could ever be. Linda was escorted away eventually, her face pale, her lips trembling, her eyes empty. She didn't protest anymore. She didn't sneer or scoff. She looked like someone who had glimpsed the end of her career and perhaps the end of her freedom, and it left her hollow. Harris wasn't far behind, slumped in his chair, muttering about corporate, about just doing his job, until the agents finally took him by the arm and walked him out of the terminal. The passengers watched it all with the rapt attention of people who knew they had witnessed history in miniature. They had come to the airport expecting the routine, and instead, they were watching justice manifest itself in real time. The boy Daniel leaned against his mother's side, his wide eyes fixed on Maya. "She's like a hero," he whispered, and his mother, her eyes damp with quiet pride, bent to kiss the top of his head. "Yes, sweetheart, she is." It wasn't just the boy who saw it that way. The passengers, the flight attendants, even the officers on duty seemed to carry themselves differently now, as though they had been reminded that accountability still meant something, that courage in the face of cruelty could still break through. Weeks passed, then months, and the story of Gate 12 did not fade. Videos from that night spread quickly, recorded from shaky phones and uploaded within hours. Millions watched Linda tear the ticket. Millions more watched Maya's stillness, her badge, her words. They watched her ask the question that cut deeper than any accusation. Was it the ticket that was suspicious, or was it the fact that a black woman held it? And in living rooms and kitchens, on buses and in break rooms, people nodded, some with anger, some with tears, because they had lived it too. They knew what it meant to be doubted, dismissed, denied, not because of rules, but because of prejudice masquerading as authority. 6 months later, Maya stood not in an airport terminal, but in a hearing room on Capitol Hill. The space was grander, the ceilings higher, the air stiffer, but the feeling was the same, an audience waiting to hear what she had to say. Behind her, projected on a large screen, was an image of the shredded ticket, the scraps pieced together in a clear evidence sleeve. To the senators gathered in front of her, it was evidence. To the public watching on television, it had become something more, a symbol of arrogance destroyed by accountability, of prejudice exposed in the harsh light of law. Maya's voice was steady as she addressed the committee. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She laid out the facts of what had happened at Gate 12, the pattern of complaints buried for years, the negligence dressed up as efficiency, the arrogance that had been allowed to thrive unchecked until it metastasized into something too large to hide. She spoke of the passengers, of the boy who saw injustice more clearly than the adults around him, of the silence that had condemned Linda and Harris more than any loud accusation could. And she spoke of what it meant for the aviation system at large, how prejudice was not just a social wrong, but a national security threat, how arrogance at a gate could ripple into negligence that endangered lives at 30,000 feet. The senators listened. Some nodded, some frowned, some scribbled notes, but the weight of her words was undeniable. When she finished, the chamber was silent for a long moment before the applause began, not raucous, not theatrical, but steady, deliberate, the sound of acknowledgement. Outside, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones pushed toward her. Maya gave only a few brief comments before stepping into the sunlight, her navy suit catching the light, her expression calm. She had never sought fame, never sought the role of symbol, but sometimes life insists on making you visible, on turning your private battles into public reckonings. As she walked down the steps, she saw a familiar face in the crowd. It was Daniel, the boy from the airport, standing with his mother, a handmade sign clutched in his hands. In uneven letters it read, "Thank you for standing up." His mother's eyes shone as she met Maya's gaze, and for the first time in months, Maya allowed herself a small, genuine smile. That night, as the city buzzed with news reports and commentary, Maya sat alone in her apartment, the image of the torn ticket framed on her desk. Not as a trophy, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a symbol of what arrogance and prejudice could unleash, and of what resolve could overcome. She thought of Linda, of Harris, of Captain Rhodes, and the flight attendants who had looked away. She thought of the countless complaints buried in files, the people who had walked away defeated because they hadn't had the chance to fight back. And she thought of Daniel, his wide eyes full of awe, his voice calling her a hero. Maya exhaled slowly, a mixture of wariness and resolve. She hadn't chosen this fight, but she had carried it, and in carrying it, she had made it matter. The story of Gate 12 would be told and retold, not because of a single ticket, but because it proved something larger, that silence can be power, that calm can be mightier than rage, and that arrogance always crumbles when faced with the steady hand of truth. In the end, the ticket that had been torn apart became more than paper. It became a symbol, stitched into the fabric of change, reminding everyone who saw it that justice is not loud or quick or easy. It is steady. It is relentless. And when it comes, it turns humiliation into history, prejudice into proof, and silence into the loudest voice of all.